Hi everyone! Welcome to my channel. Always remember, ignorance of the law excuses no one. This is Legally Engineer.
Dito, ang ginawa, may solidary debtors. Tapos may isang, for example, may isang creditor. Sabi ni creditor, ang utang nyo sa akin na 30,000, lahat-lahat, pati yung share ni B, share ni C, huwag nyo nang bayadan, okay na. Dahil friends tayo. Libre ko na din yung friends mo, B and C. Ang tanong, is A entitled to be reimbursed by B and C?
Pwede ko masabihin na ako naman talaga yung friend nun eh. So kung hindi naman dahil
sa akin, hindi naman kayo maano. So bayadan nyo ako.
Can that be possible?
Hindi, under Article 1220. Hindi naman. Sobra ka naman. Nilibre ka na nga din. Gusto mo pang kunan yung other solidarity dito. Unjust enrichment ang tawag doon.
Yes. Alright.
Okay? Okay na tayo. 1220. So let's proceed to 1221.
Again, this provision is a bit lengthy, no? Pero again, basahin nyo yung nakalagay dun sa provision ng batas under Article 1221. But this pertains to the rules in case thing has been lost or prestation has become impossible. So if the thing is lost or the prestation becomes impossible, then the liability of the solidary debtors depends upon whether or not there is fault or delay. Ano ba yung reason for the loss? Meron bang fault or delay before the loss? So if the loss is without fault and before delay, the rule there is that the obligation shall be extinguished. Extinguish niya.
So, if there was fault on the part of any one of them, all shall be responsible to the creditor for the price and the payment of damages and interest without prejudice to their action against the guilty negligent debtor.
So, di ba ang sinabi niya nga dyan, ay yung loss daw ay due to the fault of on the part of the solidary debtor. So, wala, magbabayad pa rin sila of the full
kahit isa lang sa
amount of
inyo
obligation.
may fault, all are bound to pay.
But subject to the
with
principle
damages.
na yung co-solidary debtors naman pwede magpa-reimburse dun sa totoong may kasalanan.
Sa
negligent part. Yung
negligent
at fault.
debtor.
Sa kanila naman
Okay.
siya hihingi ng recovery. And what if naman yung loss or yung loss is without fault but after delay?
So ito naman, yung loss is due to a fortuitous event but after there is delay. So what is the effect? If through a fortuitous event, the thing is lost or the performance has become impossible after one of the solidary debtors has incurred in delay, upon demand made by the creditor, the provisions of Article 1221, second paragraph shall apply. Or the same rule as number 2. Same rule as the loss is due to the fault on the part of the solidary
Malinaw naman
debtor.
na-discuss natin yung dati na kapag fortuitous
fortuitous
event,
event,
pero
delay.
bago nagkaroon ng fortuitous event, in delay naman na talaga, liable pa rin. Hindi mag-apply yung general rule na walang liability
in
pag may
case of fortuitous event. Correct. So
So,
last provision
yes.
for joint and solidary obligation. We are now in Article 1222.
So, if you're gonna read Article 1222, makikita nyo doon that these are defenses available to a solidary debtor. So, pwede naman pala. May mga
May
defenses naman
defenses.
pala. So,
those
in
are-
actions filed by the creditor, a solidary debtor may avail himself of the following defenses.
First, defenses derived from the nature of the obligation. Second, defenses personal to or which pertain to the share of the debtor sued. And third one, defenses personal to the solidary debtors.
Bigyan natin ito na example. Magandang discussion to. Halimbawa, guys, si A and B, they are solidarily liable to C in the amount of 4,000 pesos. And the entire debt of A and B was paid by D, a third person. In an action by C against A, the latter can raise the defense of payment by virtue of which the obligation was extinguished. So, derived from the nature of the obligation in this case.
So, this is a complete defense kasi there is an extinguishment by virtue of the payment made by a third person, si D.
So, take note of that. Other examples of this would be fraud, prescription, remission, illegality or absence of consideration, res judicata, non-performance of a suspensive condition. etc.
So, yun nga, extinguishment to lahat yung binanggit natin. It will extinguish the obligation.
Alright, so attorney, so punta tayo dun sa second defense, and this are defenses personal to or which pertain to share of the debtor sued. So if, for example, if the action by the creditor C is, let's say, against B, and B was insane at the time the obligation was contracted, B can actually put up the defense of insanity with respect to the entire obligation.
Yes.
This defense is, of course, personal to B alone, and it is a complete defense.
So, other example, nung number 2, yung incapacity, yung mistake, violence, minority,
etc.
So, yun.
What about defenses personal to other solidary debtors?
So, like the preceding examples, the defense of insanity is not available to A as a defense
As to release him.
from his liability for his share in the
Hindi
obligation.
naman siya insane.
Oo, si bilang it is only personal to B. However, A may avail himself thereof only as regards that part of the debt for which B is liable. Hence, having only a partial defense, A is still liable for 2,000 his share in the obligation.
Kasi magkano ba yung total obligation nila? 4,000 pesos.
Take
So,
2,000.
2,000
We
supposedly.
presuppose na 2,000 yung 2,000 sila.
So, what A can do here is to set up a partial defense
Yes.
as regards the
The
proportionate share of
of
B,
B.
who was insane at the time
The obligation was contracted.
contracted or executed. So, partial lang yun sa kanya as a defense. Okay?
Pero he cannot invoke na yung
The insanity of B to completely absolve himself from
From
liability.
liability.
Okay, so that wraps up our discussion as
Yes.
regards
joint and solidary obligations.
So now we will be proceeding with divisible and indivisible
Divisible
obligations,
obligations.
starting with Article 1223.
Yeah, so the indivisibility or divisibility of the things that are the object of obligations in which there is only one debtor and only one creditor does not alter or modify the provisions of Chapter 2 of this title. So, Article 1223 talks about divisible and indivisible obligations.
So ano ba yung meaning ng divisible and
Yan.
indivisible obligations? Una, a divisible obligation is one, the object of which in its delivery or performance is capable of partial fulfillment. In short,
Yan.
pwedeng partial ang
Pwedeng
fulfillment.
installment.
Pwede.
Partial.
An indivisible obligation is one, the object of which in its delivery or performance is not capable of partial performance. So there is a test for
Yes.
the distinction in this case.
Yes, in determining whether an obligation is divisible or not, the controlling circumstance is not the possibility or impossibility of partial prestation, but the purpose of the obligation or the intention of the parties. Kasi may mga times na yung thing naman or yung object is divisible, like money, that is divisible, that's physically divisible. Pero ang intention ng party is hindi kailangan dapat complete performance or
So,
full payment. So
you
it
look
will
at the intention.
magiging indivisible yung obligation even though the object or the thing which is the object of that obligation is physically divisible or susceptible of partial performance.
However, guys, if the object is not physically
Yan,
divisible
oo.
or the service is not susceptible of partial performance, of course, the obligation is
It's always indivisible.
indivisible.
So, ang masasabi natin dito, we can deduce that if the thing or the object, which is the subject of the obligation, is indivisible from the very beginning, the obligation is always indivisible.
Even if the
Diba?
intention of the parties are contrary to that.
Oo.
Kasi this is an absolute rule, no?
Pag indivisible ang thing, indivisible ang obligation. Pero kapag divisible ang thing,
pwedeng maging
generally divisible obligation yan. Pero you have to ascertain
The
the
intention.
intention of the parties and the purpose of the obligation.
Yes.
Pwede diyang maging indivisible.
Mhm.
Okay?
Let's proceed with Article 1224. And if
Yes.
you're going to read Article 1224 in the codal provision, you'll see that it talks about the effect of non-compliance by a debtor in a joint indivisible obligation. So, pwede naman talagang hindi mag-comply nga ang ating debtor and the obligation is joint and indivisible.
Indivisible.
So, ano ang maging effect niyan doon, Attorney Uy?
If any one of the debtors does not comply with his undertaking in a joint Remember, joint ha, ang liability. Joint indivisible obligation, the obligation is converted into one for damages. Again, yung thing is indivisible.
Oo, indivisible.
Indivisible. Tapos, ang liability ng debtors are joint. No, the liability is joint. Yun ng debtors. So, dito, kapag yung one of the joint debtors do not want to comply or refuses to comply or refuse to comply with the obligation, you simply convert it into one for payment of damages. Kasi kung ayaw nung isa, hindi na ma-perform nung ibang joint debtors kasi nga indivisible ang thing. Indivisible ang obligation.
But take note guys that in this case, the creditor cannot ask for specific performance or rescission because there is no cause of action as regards the other debtor who is willing to perform his
Yun namang other
obligation.
debtor, they are willing to perform. Only one of them or some of them does not want to comply. So, specific performance or rescission is not a remedy.
Available remedy in that case.
Yes.
So, let's proceed with Article 1225. Again, we leave it to you to read the codal provision. In this case, it talks about the situations wherein obligations are deemed indivisible. Indivisible.
Oo, indivisible.
So, when, Attorney Uy?
Yan. So, there are 4 instances wherein the obligation is deemed to be indivisible. First is obligations to give definite things. Indivisible yan lagi. And yung obligations which are not susceptible of partial performance. Makes sense.
Sing a song. Yung pwedeng installment yung
Chorus
sing.
lang. Kaya obligations provided by law to be indivisible even if the thing or service is physically divisible.
Taxes. Payment of taxes.
Tapos ito naman, obligations intended by the parties to be indivisible even if the thing or service is physically divisible.
Halimbawa, dun sa panghuling sinabi ni Attorney Uy, yung halimbawa, I promise to give Attorney Uy 1,000 pesos at the end of the month, let's say October 30. So in that case, even if divisible yung 1,000 pesos, yung pera, pero kita mo naman na ang intention namin as parties is ibigay ko ng isahan,
full
amount,
amount.
yung 1,000. So hindi pwede dun ang
Partial performance. The obligation is deemed to be indivisible.
Okay. So, kailan naman deemed divisible ng obligations?
Ito na yung obligations deemed divisible. Obligations which have for their object the execution of a certain number of days of work. Yun daw indivisible. Yung mga nasa construction, yung to paint the house, yung painting to be finished in 10 days.
10 days.
Kasi nga naman, di mo naman din nga pwedeng mag-paint ng isang araw lang.
Okay.
The second one, obligations which have for their object the accomplishment of work by metrical units.
For example, the obligation of the debtor to make a table, let's say 1.5 meters wide and 4 meters long.
Pantatlo, yung obligations which by their nature are susceptible of partial performance. The obligations, our obligation to teach the law on obligations and contracts for 1 year in BSU. That is divisible. Hindi naman isang araw mo lamang yun naman ituturo. Yun naman hati-hati. Can there be divisibility or indivisibility in obligations to do?
Well, in this case, in obligations not to do, the character of the prestation in each particular case shall determine their divisibility or indivisibility. Halimbawa, bigyan natin ng indivisible obligation yung negative obligation na meron tayo. Si A, he obliged himself to be not to sell cigarettes in his store for, let's say, 1 year. So here, the obligation is fulfilled continuously during a certain period within that
1 year.
years.
Within the 1 year period,
1 year.
hindi daw pagbebentahan ni A si B ng cigarette.
Hindi magbibenta ng cigarette. So for a span of 1 year, so within that 1 year, the obligation is indivisible. Okay. So, divisible naman ang obligation mo, an obligation not to do. Halimbawa, if the obligation of A is not to sell cigarettes in his store only during Sundays, and holidays, then the obligation here is divisible.
During Sundays lang.
Because
Hindi
the forbid-
continuous.
Hindi kasi continuous. So, a negative obligation and divisible at the same time.
So,
Okay, so in that note, we
Yes.
now wrap up the discussion as regards divisible
and
and
indivisible obligation. So, let's now go to the last part of Module 4.
Different kinds of obligations.
We are
This
now
one
in
is
Section 6, Obligations with a
a
Penal Clause.
Okay, and Article 1226, it provides that in obligations with a penal clause, the penalty shall substitute the indemnity for damages and the payment of interest in case of non-compliance if there is no stipulation to the contrary. Nevertheless, the damages shall be paid if the obligor refuses to pay the penalty or is guilty of fraud in the fulfillment of the obligation. Now, the penalty may be enforced only when it is demandable in accordance with the provisions of this code.
Yes, so Article 1226, before we discuss the provision, we define principal and accessory obligation. So, a principal obligation is one which can stand by itself and does not depend for its validity and existence upon another obligation. Pangalawa, yung accessory obligation, one which is attached to the principal obligation and therefore cannot stand alone.
Very important yung differences ng principal and accessory
Versus
obligations.
accessory.
Later on, makikita natin yung importance niyan. So, having said that, we need to
Yes.
define what is an obligation without
With
penal
penal
clause.
clause.
This is one which contains an accessory undertaking to pay a previously stipulated indemnity in case of breach of the principal prestations intended primarily to induce its fulfillment.
Yes.
So, mahalaga to kasi para ma-make sure mo na magko-comply, for example, yung parties in their agreement, naglalagay sila ng accessory.
them. Oo.
Accessory undertaking to compel the parties to perform what is incumbent upon them. So, ano bang penal clause, Attorney Uy?
A penal clause is an accessory undertaking attached to an obligation to assume greater liability in case of breach.
And ang purpose niya nga is una, to ensure their performance by
Performance.
creating an effective deterrent against breach, making the consequences of such breach as onerous as it may be possible. Kasi nga, pag hindi ka nag-comply with the accessory pag hindi ka
May
nag-comply
penalties.
sa obligation, may penalties by virtue of the accessory
And,
undertaking
yes,
in the
and
form
that
of
is
penal clause.
the general purpose of the penal clause. Yung second purpose naman niya is to substitute a penalty for the indemnity for damages in the payment of interest in case of non-compliance or to punish the debtor for the non-fulfillment of his obligation. And yung number 2 is punishment. Yung number 1 is reparation. So, instead of paying damages and interest, you pay the penalty.
Substitute kasi siya doon. Okay?
So, as stated a while ago, yung payment ng penalty will be the substitute for
damages.
payment of damages or
And
interest.
interest.
Pero there are also instances mentioned in Article 1226 wherein you have the liability to pay the penalty and you also have the liability to pay the damages. So, penalty plus damages.
So
in
the
what instances?
Yes, the creditor, in addition to the penalty, may recover damages and interests first. Of course, when so stipulated with the parties,
Yes.
kung provided talaga yun doon.
Na against of breach, may penal clause na, may penalty, magbabayad ka pa ng damages. So, pwede yun, may stipulation.
Pangalawa naman, when the obligor refuses to pay the penalty, in which case the
Yan.
creditor may recover legal interest thereon kapag ayaw magbayad ng
So,
penalty.
kapag ayaw mo pa magbayad ng penalty, mas madodoblihan ka. Kasi pwedeng mag-recover ng legal interest. Yan yung damages dyan.
Yes.
Oh.
Tapos pangatlo, when the obligor is, of course, guilty of fraud in the fulfillment of the
Yan.
obligation, in which case, the creditor may recover damages caused by such fraud. So, fraudulent kasi,
Yes,
no? So,
oo.
meron pa dyang damages.
So, pwedeng mag-recover ng damages aside from, in addition to the penalty kapag when so stipulated by the parties, when there is refusal on the part of the debtor to pay the penalty. And yung pantatlo naman is fraud.
And guilty of fraud. And question that we have now is, when can this penalty be
Be
enforced?
enforced.
And
Oh.
we know that by
Kailan?
law, the penalty may be enforced only when it is demandable in accordance with the provisions of the Civil Code. So this means that the penalty as a stipulation in a contract is demandable only if there is a breach
Yan.
of the obligation and it is not contrary to law, morals, good
So,
customs, public order, or public policy.
meron dalawang condition para maging enforceable ang penalty. Kapag, syempre, may breach. Una, dapat may breach of the obligation. At padalawa, the penalty must not be contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, and public policy.
Thus, if the obligation cannot be fulfilled due to a fortuitous event, for instance, then the penalty is not demandable. Kasi malino naman yun sa Civil Code.
Yes, the accessory follows the principal.
Okay, so now let's proceed with Article 1227. And if you're gonna read the provision itself, it talks about the penalty not as a substitute for performance. So ano ba ibig sabihin ng attorney?
So generally kasi, the debtor cannot just pay the penalty instead of performing the obligation. The purpose of the penalty is to secure compliance with his obligation. If the debtor is allowed to pay the penalty, this would in effect make the obligation an alternative one. Tama nga naman. Kasi kung magiging
Kung option na niya, I mean,
Oo.
option sa kanya na siya na magbayad na lang siya ng
so
penalty,
penalty,
instead
hindi
of
magiging
perform the obligation.
perform the obligation or pay the penalty. Parang ganon. Magiging alternative.
Which is not.
Oo, and ang sabi kasi dyan, yung penal clause, it is only presumed as subsidiary. Oo.
So, in addition to that,
Attorney Maralit, pwede bang ang debtor may be exempted from liability, from non-fulfillment of the obligation?
well, the debtor can exempt himself from the non-fulfillment of the obligation only when this right has been expressly reserved for him or
Yan.
expressly provided na he has
Oo,
that
so
right.
generally, hindi pwedeng mag-insist ang debtor na magbabayad na lang siya ng penalty instead of the fulfillment of the obligation. Unless such right has been expressly reserved for him.
Nasa agreement naman yun. Kung pinag-agreehan nila yun, nasa contract yan. It's
Yes.
the law between them. But take note guys that as a general rule, the creditor cannot demand the fulfillment of the obligation and the satisfaction of the penalty at the
At the
same
same time,
Yun
yan, hindi
yan.
naman, pwede din naman na ang creditor magde-demand ng fulfillment plus magbabayad ka pa ng penalty.
Yes, kasi nga the primary
Oo.
purpose of the penalty is to urge the debtor
Yan.
to the performance of, the main obligation. And so, for example, where there is performance, once the obligation is fulfilled, then the purpose is already attained. And therefore, there is no need.
for demanding the penalty. Correct. Kasi nga, sabi natin kanina, the penal clause or the penalty is only enforceable when there is breach of obligation. At saka, dapat hindi siya contrary to law, morals, good customs, public order, or public policy.
And that's the general rule, but the exception there is when the right has been clearly granted the creditor, no? Parang kanina doon sa debtor, he cannot choose non-fulfillment and payment na lang ng penalty unless the right has been expressly reserved for him. Ganun din naman sa creditor. The creditor may not demand for the fulfillment and the penalty at the same time unless the same is clearly granted upon him. Okay? Now, where there is no performance, in case of non-compliance, the creditor may ask for the penalty or require
specific performance. So, meron siyang dalawang remedy kapag pag may non-compliance on the part of the debtor. So, he may ask for the payment ng penalty o kaya specific performance.
And these are alternative remedies and not successive or cumulative, no? Kasi, of course, this is subject to the exception that the penalty may be enforced if after the creditor has decided to require fulfillment, the same should become impossible.
So sabi natin,
without his fault.
yung penalty, yung payment of the penalty, o kaya yung specific performance, they are alternative and not cumulative or not successive remedies. Exception when the creditor has when the creditor chose the remedy of specific performance but the latter has become impossible.
Hindi na
Hindi na
ma-perform
pwede. So,
pwedeng
yun.
mag-option siya ng payment of the
penalty.
Of course, guys, if there's fraud on the part of the debtor, the creditor may recover the
Yan.
penalty as well as the damage
Damages.
for non-fulfillment.
Correct.
Okay, so let's proceed with Article 1228, which provides that the proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is not necessary in order that the penalty may be demanded. Paka-explain naman yung attorney mo yan.
So, the penalty is always demandable without proof of actual damages. So ito, in an obligation with a penal clause, all that the debtor has to prove to enforce the penalty is the violation of the obligation by the debtor. So breach lang or violation of the obligation of debtor will suffice para makakolekta ka ng makapag-demand ka ng payment of penalty. Sabi dyan, proof of actual damages suffered by the creditor is not necessary.
So, kasi indeed, one of the main reasons why merong ganitong provision sa ating agreement or sa contract na meron tayo is of course to avoid the necessity and other difficulties involved in litigation. So, kaya nga hindi na kailangan mag-present ng proof as regards the losses and damages para makarecover nung amount or the penalty na provided sa agreement nila.
Yes.
And of course, the creditor may enforce the penalty whether he suffered damages or not, but he cannot recover more than the stipulated penalty even if he proves that the amount of his damage exceeds the penalty. Hindi pwedeng mag-exceed ka sa penalty na meron ka.
Stipulated dun sa contract.
Kasi hindi naman for profit din naman ito na lalampas dun sa...
Yes. So, Article 1228 applies only where the penalty is fixed by the parties to substitute the indemnity for damages. So, ibig sabihin, kailangan may penalty stipulated, may penal clause. Yung contract or yung obligation dapat may penal clause para ma-enforce mo yung penalty plus indemnity for damages. Oo. Kasi kung wala, o kaya para ma-enforce mo yung penalty in lieu of damages, kailangan may stipulation. Kung wala, payment of damages lang.
So, there. And again, ulitin lang natin no, na damages are recoverable in addition to penalty. In that case, the damages must be proved kapag in addition to the damages and penalty na
yung damages lang ipuprove, yung amount of damages to be awarded. Pero yung penalty, kung ano yung fix doon, you cannot change that.
How about, attorney, can the judge equitably reduce the penalty? For example?
Yes, under Article 1229, ang sabi dyan, the judge shall equitably reduce the penalty when the principal obligation has been partly or irregularly complied with by the debtor. Even if there has been no performance, the penalty may also be reduced by the courts if it is iniquitous or unconscionable. So it mentions two circumstances when the penalty may be reduced by the courts. Ang una, when there is partial or irregular performance. Ibig sabihin, may performance pero partial lang, konti lang, o irregular. O yung padalawa naman, when the penalty agreed upon is iniquitous or unconscionable, pag sobra-sobra naman yung amount ng penalty, labis-labis naman, sobra naman.
Pwedeng mag-interfere din ng court to...
Kasi in that case, kung ang penalty agreed upon is unconscionable or iniquitous, that is against morals. Oo. In public policy.
Right. So again, the court will come to the rescue and temper the penalty. Okay. So let's proceed with Article 1230. Yes, and this is the last provision covered by the different kinds of obligations, particularly as regards obligations with the penal clause. So ano bang sinasabi ng Article 1230, Attorney Uy?
Yes. So Article 1230, the nullity of the principal clause does not carry with it the nullity of the principal obligation. The nullity of the principal obligation carries with it that of the penal clause.
Ito napapasok ang sinabi natin kanina na importance ng sinabi mo na dinefine mo na ang principal obligation, it can stand on its own, accessory obligation,
it is also based on the civil law principle na accessory follows the principal.
So now, again, what's the effect of the nullity of the penal clause, Attorney Uy?
So the nullity of the penal clause will not necessarily invalidate the principal obligation. Because the principal obligation, as we stated earlier, can stand alone.
Such that if only the penal clause is void,
Oo.
then the
Then,
principal obligation remains
valid.
and demandable.
Yes.
And the penal clause is just disregarded.
It is as if no penal clause has been agreed upon.
And
Yun yung accessory obligation is the penal clause.
And the injured party may recover indemnity for damages in case of non-performance of the obligation as if no penalty had been stipulated according to Article 1170 naman. Okay. So kasi may damages pa rin naman tayo in any way kahit na walang napag-usapan na penalty, penal clause. So, bigyan natin ng example, no?
Yes.
Halimbawa,
Example.
si S, nag-agree siya to sell the merchandise, a certain merchandise to B, buyer. It is provided in their agreement that in case of default, then S will deliver a prohibited drug as
As a
penalty.
penalty.
So, alin dyan ang principal obligation?
Ang principal obligation is the obligation of the seller to deliver the merchandise to the buyer.
And what is the
The
accessory?
accessory obligation, yung penal clause, na kapag hindi nag-deliver si S ng merchandise kay B, ang i-deliver na lang is a prohibited drug as a penalty.
Right, so
Diba?
here in this case, the obligation to sell merchandise is perfectly valid,
Valid.
but the penalty to deliver the prohibited drug is of course void for
Void.
being illegal.
Legal.
Diba?
Oo.
And
That is
so,
legally
for
impossible.
failure of S to comply with his obligation, si B may recover damages na lang under Article 1170 of the Civil Code instead of
penalty.
Penalty.
Because the penalty is considered as not written or there is no penal
Disregarded.
clause agreed upon. Oo, parang ganun. So in that case, kung walang penalty, edi damages
under 1170.
under 1170
Papasok
in
pa rin
case of non-compliance by S of
Oo.
the delivery of the merchandise.
So,
Okay?
in any way, protected pa rin naman talaga. Okay?
Mm-mm.
What is the effect of the nullity of the principal obligation naman?
If the principal obligation is void, the penal clause is likewise
Yan
void.
na.
Kasi nga, sabi natin, the penal
Package.
clause is an accessory obligation. And accessory obligation exists only in relation to the principal obligation. Oh.
So, the reason is that the penal clause cannot stand alone without the principal
Yan,
obligation to which
oo.
it is merely subordinated.
Yes, subordinate, subsidiary, ancillary. So, kung walang principal, walang penal clause. Pero kung ang penal clause ay void,
Mhm.
valid, at kung valid pa rin yung principal obligation, hindi valid pa rin. It remains valid.
Attorney, what if naman yung nullity of the principal obligation is due to the fault of the debtor who acted in bad faith? Ano naman ang mangyayari doon?
In that case, the penalty may be enforced. No? This is an exception. If the nullity of the principal is due to the fault of the debtor
Who acted in
who
bad
acted
faith?
in bad faith by reason of which the creditor suffered damages, the penalty may be enforced on equitable grounds.
So,
Principles of
equity ang pag-usapan
equity.
dyan.
Correct.
You can pertain to Articles 10, 19, 20, and 21 of the new
The new
Civil
Civil
Code,
Code.
talking about equity, no, as regards
Yes.
equitable grounds. So, bigyan natin ng last example.
Example,
Is
okay.
halimbawa si S, nag-agree siya to deliver to B 2 grams of prohibited drugs. So, in this case, the contract carries a penal clause to the effect that in case of non-compliance with the obligation, S would pay a penalty of 10,000 pesos. Attorney Uy, what is the principal and what is the accessory in this case?
Here, the principal obligation is to deliver 2 grams of prohibited drugs.
Ang accessory,
Ang accessory obligation is S would pay a penalty of 10,000 pesos in case of non-compliance.
so what can you say about the principal
The
obligation?
principal obligation is legally impossible,
So,
therefore void.
Nullity.
Mm-mm.
Oh. Ang accessory
null and
obligation, is it,
Accessory
ano?
since the principal, according to 1230, the nullity of the principal obligation carries with it the nullity of the accessory obligation to pay 10,000 pesos.
So kahit na yung accessory on its own is
It's
valid
valid.
naman, for the fact na it's merely subordinated to the principal obligation which as we've said is a
Is
nullity.
nullity.
Therefore, null na rin yung penal
Penal
clause na meron
clause.
tayo. So hindi pwedeng sabihin doon ni creditor na okay, hindi mo i-deliver yung yung drugs basta bigyan mo ako ng 10,000 sa penalty.
Cannot
Nope.
be.
Cannot be borrow one from one.
Cannot be.
Ayan, so take note of that. And on that note, we are officially wrapping up the
Module
discussion
4.
on Module 4, the
Oo.
different kinds of obligations.
And if you want a more detailed discussion, yung mga examples, you can refer to the prescribed textbook.
Yes. So, again, on that note, guys, thank you for listening to us, for supporting our video series, lectures, our YouTube channel. And on that note, I am Attorney Benrick A. Maralit.
And I'm Attorney April Uy.
Always remember, ignorance of the law excuses no one. See you soon after the midterm examination. Bye-bye.
Bye.